Welcome to the 700 Club. Just 1 year ago, 21-year-old Mahsa Amini was brutally murdered at the hands of Iran's morality police. Her crime? Violating the mandatory Islamic dress code.
Her death sparked protests not seen since the 1979 revolution. Now, as Iranians prepare to honor her legacy, the Islamic regime is once again cracking down. George Thomas reports.
With the help of Chinese facial recognition technology, the Iranian regime has arrested more than 22,000 people and killed over 630 protesters for taking part in demonstrations following Mahsa Amini's murder a year ago.
One of the things that we're already seeing in the lead up to the first anniversary of her murder is increased suppression.
A new report released by the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom states Iranian authorities also continue to persecute religious minorities with imprisonment, torture, and forced disappearances.
Christians report that they're getting pressure from the government not to participate in protests. And if they do participate and they're arrested, they are sexually assaulted in prison.
Iran's so-called morality police brutally killed 21-year-old Amini last September for allegedly having a small bit of her hair showing out of her hijab. The response triggered the longest nationwide protests since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Mitra Jasni, an Iranian political activist, tells CBN News that Amini's death continues to haunt the regime in Tehran.
Many around the world view the tragic death of Mahsa Amini as a symbol of women's resistance against the mandatory hijab. For Iranians, Mahsa Amini murder served as a rallying call, motivating them to unite against the oppressive regime and seek its end.
Iran's President Ibrahim Raisi tells NBC News he has no regrets over how his government deals with those who continue to protest Amini's murder.
It's not a surprise that he has no regret because Raisi is a psychopath and mass murderer. One of these things on his record is that over a few weeks, he killed thousands of political prisoners and then ordered cream puff to celebrate that.
Authorities are preparing for more protests ahead of the anniversary on the 16th.
Every day we get the news about people being arrested, and that shows that the regime is really afraid, is really scared, and is getting ready for a show of force with the people.
Meanwhile, a new hijab and chastity bill making its way through Iran's parliament calls for increased fines and jail time of 5 to 10 years for women caught violating so-called modesty laws. Jasni says the protest this past year shows Iranian women aren't backing down.
We want this regime change. We want to take back our country. So we never afraid from new rules. That this is not new for us because it started since 40 years ago.
George Thomas, CBN News.
This report should give everyone chills as to what can happen when a government gets a hold of high-tech facial recognition. So all they have to do is point a camera on a drone at a crowd and get the faces of everyone participating in a protest. And we're seeing that right now in this country. In Iran, we're seeing it. What they did was target the leaders of the protests, and they put them on trial, and then they executed them. And you heard the leader then celebrated by ordering cream puffs. He thought he was doing something really good and really noble by killing people. He's not, we have no idea what it's like to live under that kind of regime, that kind of authority that says it's certainly fine to kill citizens who are protesting something that was absolutely horrific. That young girl was beaten to death in the custody of the police. They wanted to teach her a lesson and teach a lesson to all other women. This is the way you've got to go, and you've got to hide every strand of your hair. Let's realize this kind of technology in the hands of government that turns against its own people is an extraordinary danger. And it's something we all need to watch out for because governments do change, but this technology doesn't seem to. So let's look at what China is doing. Let's look at what Iran is doing. And on behalf of everyone in the international community, let's protest it. Let's say this shouldn't be happening. You shouldn't be turning the weapons of the state against your own citizens. Well, in other news, Republican Senator Mitt Romney announced he's stepping aside, and he's calling on others to join him. John Jessup has more on that story from our CBN News Bureau in Washington. John?
Thanks, Gordon. The one-time senator from Utah and 2012 Republican nominee for president told reporters it's time for his generation to make way for new leaders.
I just don't think that we need another person in their 80s. I'm a little long of tooth already. We don't need more like me. The issues of the day relate to China, climate change, AI, and a lot of guys in their 80s who know how to deal with those issues. But I do think that the times we're living in really demand the next generation to step up and express their point of view and to make the decisions that will shape our American politics over the coming century. And just having a bunch of guys who were around, the baby boomers, who are around in the post-war era, we're not the right ones to be making the decisions for tomorrow.
President Biden is 80, and former President Trump, the leading candidate in the Republican field, is just 3 years behind him at 77. Romney expected a tough primary challenge in 2024 due to his opposition to Trump. He's the only Republican senator who voted to impeach him twice. No word yet on potential candidates for his seat. Well, in economic news, a spike in gas prices is fueling high inflation, even as costs for other goods ticked up at a more modest rate last month. The Consumer Price Index rose 3.7% in August compared to the same time last year. That's up from 3.2% in July. Core prices rose at 4.3% rather last month, down from 4.7% in July, the smallest increase in almost 2 years. Those numbers remain far above the Federal Reserve's 2% target, though the White House says the conflicting data still signals overall inflation is cooling. Well, turning overseas now, where unprecedented flooding has taken more than 5,000 lives in Libya. With at least 9,000 more people still missing, officials believe the death toll will certainly rise. Meanwhile, survivors are calling on the world to send help. CBN's Mark Martin has a story.
Search teams in Libya scour streets, damaged buildings, and even the sea, looking for bodies after the deadly flooding.
This entire city has been destroyed. There are victims still under the rubble, and some are in the sea. There are bodies buried in mass graves because the cemeteries are full.
Health officials fear an outbreak of disease with a large number of bodies yet to be recovered. The city's mayor says up to 20,000 may have been swept away by the rising waters. Mediterranean storm Daniel pounded the Libyan coast Sunday night, causing the devastating flooding. 2 dams in the mountains above Derna collapsed, sending raging waters through the city, washing out entire neighborhoods. Emergency officials report that the flooding wiped out a quarter of the city. Aid workers report thousands are still missing and tens of thousands are without homes. Now residents are pleading for international help.
The United Nations, relief agencies, and the World Health Organization need to step in with aid for our city. The state alone cannot handle this. We need to be clear about that. Our resources are limited. Many have come forward to help with what they can, but we are looking for help from organizations like the United Nations.
Flood victims say the only warning was the loud explosions when the dams outside their city broke. The intense flooding showed the power of the storm, but also exposed Libya's weaknesses. Rival governments divide the country, leading to nationwide neglect of infrastructure. Local media report the dams that broke outside Derna were built in the 1970s and have not been maintained for years. Mark Martin, CBN News.
Thank you, Mark. Just devastating scenes there. Well, 5 weeks since wildfires ravaged the town of Lahaina on the Hawaiian island of Maui, officials say 41 people are still missing. As Wendy Griffith reports, survivors are still amazed about their narrow escape from what looked like certain death.
Of everyone I interviewed in Maui, the one thing they all had in common was that if they had waited even 5 minutes longer to leave their homes, they would not have survived.
And I saw smoke coming toward our house, so I called my wife. She was home alone. I told her to get out of there.
36-year-old videographer David Phelps saw the smoke racing toward his Lahaina home as he headed to pick up his kids from school.
At this point, we didn't know how bad it was, so I didn't know what to tell her. I felt completely helpless. I had my 2 children with me. I didn't know if I should go back in the fire or... So it was really traumatic.
Meanwhile, heavy traffic had pinned in David's wife, Marissa, leaving her nowhere to go.
Oh, my God. She calls me. Her car is getting enveloped with smoke. She's crying. My wife is not a dramatic person, so I knew it was serious. Luckily, someone in front of her went up on the sidewalk, and she just followed him out, and she got out, and thank God.
It wasn't until later they realized Marissa's miracle of survival.
Our friend's parents were 10 minutes behind her. They didn't make it, and they died from smoke inhalation, yeah. And they were just minutes behind her. That could have been her.
36-year-old Dustin Dudois and his family also found themselves in danger.
The wind pushed so hard I could feel the heat as if the fire was next to me, but it was a block away.
By the time Dustin pulled away from his house, the fire engulfed homes on his street. He and his family narrowly escaped.
It was pretty much like a bag of clothes, and my wife grabbed, I think, the documents. And then, yeah, that was it. Everything else was just ashes.
Since the fire, David posted a video on Instagram capturing the moment hundreds of surfers took part in a paddle-out ceremony to remember the victims of Lahaina. One of his collaborators said making the video was crazy therapy and that hope and community is the only thing keeping us going right now.
I've heard people asking, where is God and all this? He's here. I see it. I see it in everyone's faces that's helping. I see it in everyone in this church. He's fully here. I've never believed so much in my life.
Getting me back in the water, doing what I love.
Dustin, a self-described fishing addict, lost all of his fishing gear in the fire. When Operation Blessing heard about his plight, they stepped in with brand new fishing spears and fins.
That's when I talk to God the most, is when I'm diving, I really do. It's just in my head and, just kind of, it's like my church. Give me some sort of a normalcy, I guess, So I'm very thankful for Operation Blessing.
Wendy Griffith, CBN News, Maui.
Thank you, Wendy Gordon. It's amazing to hear the testimony those survivors say, even in the midst of so much suffering, they saw that God is there.
Yeah, God is always our very present help in time of trouble. If you're ever in trouble, realize that you can call on His name. He will be there, and He will be a very present help for you.